The night my mother-in-law told my dad he was sitting at the wrong table, she said it the way you'd correct a lost tourist. Polite enough on the surface, dismissive underneath. And my husband, the man I had just married 4 hours earlier, stood right next to her and said nothing. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not what she said, what he didn't do. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name doesn't matter as much as the story does, but for the sake of telling it honestly, I'm Serena. I'm 31 years old. I'm a civil engineer who spent 6 years designing bridges, which is funny, looking back, because I spent the last 2 years of my relationship trying to build one between two families that had no interest in meeting in the middle. My husband's name is Holden. He comes from old Connecticut money, the kind that doesn't talk about money because they don't have to. His mother, Margaret, is the kind of woman who hosts charity galas and uses the word appropriate as a weapon. His father passed when Holden was in college, so it's always been Margaret, Margaret's opinion, Margaret's preference, Margaret's vision of what Holden's life should look like. My parents are from Tucson. My dad spent 30 years as a high school history teacher. My mom did bookkeeping for a dental practice until she retired. They raised me and my younger brother in a 3-bedroom house on a street where people actually knew their neighbors. We weren't poor, we were normal, and in Margaret's world, normal is its own kind of poor. I met Holden at a work conference in Chicago. He was presenting on sustainable urban development. I challenged one of his assumptions during the Q&A, and he found me afterward at the hotel bar and said, "You were right, by the way." I thought that was the most attractive thing a man had ever said to me. I should have paid more attention to the fact that it was also one of the last times he'd admit it. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. During those 2 years, I met Margaret exactly 7 times. Every single time, she asked me questions that sounded like compliments but weren't. "Oh, you actually designed that overpass? How interesting that they let someone so young lead a project like that. That kind of thing." And every time, Holden would squeeze my hand under the table and whisper later, "She doesn't mean it the way it sounds." I believed him. That's on me. The engagement was 18 months long because Margaret needed time to plan a wedding that reflected what she called the Ashworth standard. I had opinions. I expressed them. They were heard and then quietly ignored. The venue was her choice, a historic estate in Newport, Rhode Island. The florist was her contact. The caterer was her recommendation. By the time we were 6 months out, I had won exactly 2 battles, my dress and the song for our first dance. And even then, she told me the song was an unusual choice. My parents tried to stay out of it. My mom said, "It's one day, baby. Just get through it, and then it's your life." My dad said even less. He was twatched, and my dad is a man who notices everything and comments on almost nothing, which is a specific kind of wisdom I didn't fully appreciate until that Saturday evening in September. The rehearsal dinner was the night before the wedding. Margaret had organized it at a private club in Newport, white tablecloths, engraved menus, the whole thing. My parents drove up from the airport and walked in looking exactly like what they are: good, decent, warm people who had dressed carefully for an occasion they wanted to honor. My mom had bought a new dress. My dad had his good blazer dry cleaned. Margaret greeted them at the door and said, "Oh, you made it. Wonderful." The way you'd say it about a package that arrived later than expected. I saw my mom's smile flicker for just a half second. She recovered fast, because she's graceful like that. My dad just shook Margaret's hand and said it was a pleasure to be there. And he meant it, and that made it worse somehow. The dinner was fine on the surface, fine the way a room is fine when everyone has agreed not to talk about the thing everyone is thinking about. Holden's family filled one end of the table. Cousins, aunts, old family friends who all seemed to know each other from boarding school or sailing regattas or whatever world they'd grown up in. My parents sat at the other end with my brother and his girlfriend, making their own warmth because the room wasn't providing any. At one point, I walked by and heard my mom laughing at something my brother said, genuinely laughing, and I felt a wave of something I couldn't name right then. I know now it was grief. Pre-grief. The kind you feel before the loss has even fully happened. Holden gave a toast that night. It was well written and funny, and it mentioned his mother 4 times and my parents once, and that once was their names tacked onto a general thank you at the end. I told myself he was nervous. I told myself it was just a rehearsal dinner. The wedding day itself started early and moved the way wedding days do. Fast and blurry and slightly unreal. I had my mom and my best friend Claudia and the bridal suite with me. Claudia has been my person since college. She's the kind of friend who will tell you the truth even when you're not ready to hear it. And on that morning, she kept looking at me with this careful expression. Like she was deciding whether to say something. She didn't. Not yet. The ceremony was beautiful, I'll say that. The estate had this long stone terrace overlooking the water, and the light was the kind you can't plan for. Golden, low, the very end of summer. I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, and he leaned over right before we reached Holden and whispered, "You look like your grandmother. She would have loved this." And I almost fell apart completely, right there, and somehow held it together. Holden cried when he saw me. I have to give him that. Whatever else I say, that was real. We said our vows, we signed the license, we took what felt like 400 photographs on the terrace while the guests moved to the reception hall and cocktail hour began. My face hurt from smiling. My feet already hurt from the shoes. Holden kept his arm around me the entire time, and I thought, we did it. We actually did it. Then Claudia appeared on my elbow. She had this look on her face, the truth-telling look, the one I'd seen before, and my stomach dropped before she even opened her mouth. "I need to show you something," she said, "before you go in." She walked me around the side entrance to the reception hall, to a set of double doors that were propped open, and she pointed through them at the seating arrangement inside. I didn't understand what I was looking at for a second. The room was gorgeous. Round tables with tall floral centerpieces, candlelight, everything Margaret had promised. And at the very front, the head table where the wedding party and immediate family were meant to sit. I found my parents' name cards in about 4 seconds. They were at table 11. Table 11 was near the back, close to the kitchen doors, next to Holden's third cousin twice removed and some family friends I'd never met. My parents, the bride's parents, were at table 11. The head table had 9 seats. Every single one of them was a member of Holden's family. 2 aunts I'd met once, 3 cousins, Holden's godmother, Margaret herself, of course, positioned right next to where Holden would sit. I stood there and counted the seats 3 times because I thought I was misreading something. I wasn't. I went back outside and found my parents. My dad was standing near the garden with a glass of water, watching the water, doing that quiet thing he does. My mom was talking to one of Holden's aunts with the patient, gracious expression she'd been wearing all weekend. "Dad," I said, "did you see where you're seated?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sure it's fine, Serena," which meant he'd already seen. I found Holden near the bar laughing at something with his cousin. I touched his arm and pulled him a few steps away and said very quietly, "My parents are at table 11. He blinked. "What?" "Table 11, near the kitchen. My parents." Something moved across his face. Discomfort, recognition, I couldn't tell which. He said, "I'm sure it's just how the room was arranged. There are a lot of guests. There are 9 seats at the head table, and every one of them is your family. Serena. It's our wedding." He set his jaw in the way he does when he's decided he's done discussing something. "Let's just get through tonight and I'll talk to my mother about it tomorrow. Okay? It's just a table." And there it was, the sentence I should have recognized as a pattern months earlier. It's just this. It's just that. It's just your parents' dignity at your wedding reception. So can we not make it a whole thing? I walked away from him. I found Margaret near the entrance to the hall, holding a glass of champagne, surveying the room like a general reviewing troops. "I need to talk to you about the seating," I said. She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Everything looks beautiful, doesn't it?" My parents are at table 11. Yes, she said. The room arrangement worked out that way. I had to accommodate the family properly. They're the bride's parents. They should be at the head table. She tilted her head slightly, the way she always does when she's about to say something that will sound reasonable and be cruel. Serena, the head table represents the Ashworth family. That's tradition. Your parents will be very comfortable at table 11. It's a lovely table. I looked at her for a long moment. Did Holden know about this? She smiled again. Holden trusts me to handle the details. That was the answer, actually. That was the whole answer, and I just didn't know what to do with it yet. I went to the restroom and sat in a stall for 4 minutes and did the math on my life. I thought about my dad's blazer that he'd had dry cleaned. I thought about my mom's new dress. I thought about my dad saying, "I'm sure it's fine," Serena in that voice he uses when he's protecting me from knowing how much something hurt him. Then I thought about what I was willing to accept, and what I wasn't. I walked out of the restroom and found Claudia. "I need your phone," I said, "and I need you to not ask me any questions for the next 10 minutes. She handed me her phone without a word. I made 2 calls. The first was to my brother, who was somewhere in the garden. The second was to my father's old college roommate, a man named Arthur, who had driven up from New Haven to be there and who had spent 30 years as a family law attorney. He was a guest, but more importantly, he was someone I trusted. Then I found the venue coordinator and asked her one question. Could she bring me a wireless microphone? She looked at me a little uncertainly. I told her I wanted to make a toast before dinner. She brought me the microphone. The reception began the way receptions do. The wedding party was announced. We were seated. The first course came out. I sat at the head table next to Holden. I looked out at the room. I found table 11 without trying. My father had his napkin in his lap and he was speaking to the woman beside him, being exactly who he's always been. Gracious, interested, generous with his attention, at the wrong table, at his daughter's wedding. Holden leaned over and said, "You okay?" I said, "I will be." When the salad plates were cleared, I stood up. I didn't ask for attention. I just stood and waited, and the room quieted on its own the way rooms do when they sense something is about to shift. "I want to say a few words," I said into the microphone. "I know there will be other toasts tonight, but there's something I need to say right now while everyone is here." I looked at Holden. His expression had gone careful. "I want to talk about the people in this room who made me who I am." I let that land for a second. My parents have been married for 36 years. My father taught high school history for 3 decades. I grew up watching him grade papers at the kitchen table every night, watching him care about his students the way some people care about their careers. My mother kept our family together through every hard thing that came at us, and hard things did come. And she handled all of it with more grace than I've ever been able to muster. I found my dad's face across the room. He had gone very still. "They paid for half of this wedding," I continued. "They flew across the country. They dressed up, and they showed up, and they have been nothing but kind to everyone in this room this entire weekend." I paused. "And they are sitting at table 11. The room changed. You could feel it, a collective intake of breath, a shift in the air. A few people near the head table looked down at their place cards. "I want them here," I said, "at this table, with me, because that's where the parents of the bride are supposed to be." I set the microphone down on the table. Then I walked the full length of the room to table 11 in my wedding dress in front of everyone, and I held out my hand to my father. He looked up at me. His eyes were bright. He said quietly so only I could hear, "You don't have to do this." "I know," I said. "Come on, Dad." My mom was already standing. She was trying not to cry and almost succeeding. I walked them both back up to the head table. I moved 2 of Holden's cousins, politely, with apology, with a smile, and I put my parents in those seats, on either side of me. The room was silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping. Then more people, and more, until it was most of the room. Not everyone. Margaret was not clapping. Holden was not clapping. But most of the room was. I sat down between my parents. My mom took my hand under the table. My dad put his hand on top of hers. Holden leaned across me and said to my father, "I'm sorry about the confusion with the seating." His voice was stiff. His jaw was set. He was using the word confusion to describe a choice. My father looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, son." And I understood right then, watching my dad give grace to a man who hadn't earned it, exactly what kind of man I had married, and exactly what it was going to cost me. The reception continued. People ate and drank and danced, the way people do, because life is insistent like that. My parents stayed at the head table. They danced together during the third song. My dad spun my mom on the dance floor and she really laughed, the full version. And I watched them and thought, this is what 36 years looks like. This is what I want. Margaret left early. She said she had a headache. She gave Holden a long look on her way out that I was meant to see and did. Holden and I didn't talk about it that night. We were in the suite by midnight and we were exhausted, and we had the careful silence of two people who both know a conversation is coming and are choosing to defer it. I lay in the dark and listened to him breathe and thought about the word confusion and what it said about him, that was the word he'd chosen. The conversation came 3 days later. In the kitchen of the apartment we'd already started calling ours, surrounded by wedding gifts we hadn't opened yet. He said his mother was upset. He said the way I'd handled it was embarrassing. He said I could have come to him privately and he would have fixed it. I asked him if he'd known, and he said it didn't matter now. I said it mattered to me, and he said it mattered to me, and he said, "Serena, this is exactly what I mean. You make everything into something." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Your mother told me the head table represents the Ashworth family. She said that in front of me, and you stood next to her all weekend and let her treat my parents like they were extras in a movie about your family." He said he was sorry I felt that way. I had heard that sentence before from him in different configurations. "I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry you took it like that. I'm sorry this is hard for you." Always the apology shaped so that the problem was my feeling, not his behavior. I went to stay with Claudia that week. I told myself it was just to get space and think. But I packed a careful bag, the kind of bag you pack when you're not sure how long you'll be gone. Claudia made coffee and sat across from me at her kitchen table and finally said the thing she'd been holding since the morning of the wedding. "I saw the seating chart 2 hours before the reception started," she said. "I went to Holden. I told him. He said his mother had handled the arrangements and he didn't want to get into it." I set my coffee down. "He knew," I said. "He knew," she said. There's a specific kind of quiet that comes over you when the last thing you'd hoped wasn't true turns out to be true. It's not loud. It doesn't feel the way you expect grief to feel. It feels like a door closing very gently on a room you've been standing in for a long time. I called my mother that night. I told her what Claudia had told me. There was a long pause on the line. Then she said, "I know, baby." "You knew he knew?" "I suspected. Your father suspected. We didn't want to ruin your day." I thought about my dad saying, "I'm sure it's fine, Serena," and the way his face had looked at table 11, and the way he'd said, "You don't have to do this when I came to get them," and I understood now the full weight of what he'd been carrying quietly so I wouldn't have to. That was the thing that finally broke me. Not Holden. Not Margaret. My father, protecting me from the truth at his own expense because that is simply who he is. I found an attorney, not Arthur, someone local, someone who specialized in exactly this kind of beginning of a marriage ending. I won't walk through all of it. The meetings, the paperwork, the conversation I had with Holden when I told him I wanted to separate. He cried. He said he loved me. He said he would change. He said I was overreacting to something that was fundamentally about a seating chart. I said it was never about the seating chart. He didn't understand that, and that was, in its own way, the final answer. We were separated by November. The divorce was finalized the following spring. I kept my name, I'd never changed it anyway, a fact Margaret had mentioned twice in 9 months with what she called concern. My parents visited me in March, when the settlement was done and I had moved into a new apartment in the same city, smaller but fully mine. My dad helped me hang curtains. My mom organized my kitchen with the specific efficiency of a woman who raised 2 children in a house where everything had its place. We ordered pizza and sat on the floor of my half-furnished living room because I didn't have a couch yet, and my dad told a story about a student he'd had 20 years ago who just sent him a letter out of nowhere, and my mom kept interrupting with the details he forgot. And I sat between them and thought about what I'd walked away from and what I'd walked toward. Not every table you're given is the right table. Some of them you have to leave, and some of them you have to walk the full length of a room to find in front of everyone, in your wedding dress, with the lights on and the music paused and everyone watching. My dad was worth that walk. My mom was worth that walk. I just wish I'd understood earlier that a man who wouldn't take that walk with me wasn't worth the chair. I keep thinking about my father's blazer, the one he had dry cleaned for my wedding. He didn't tell me he'd done that. I found out later, from my mom, the way you find out the small things people do quietly because they love you and don't want credit for it. That's the image I come back to when I try to make sense of everything that happened. Not the seating chart. Not Margaret's smile. Not Holden saying it's just a table, like my parents' dignity, was a minor inconvenience to be managed. Just my dad, alone in his closet a week before the wedding, deciding his daughter's day was worth a trip to the dry cleaner. Actions like that don't shout, they accumulate, and eventually, if you're paying attention, they tell you everything you need to know about a person's character and about your own. I spent a long time after the divorce asking myself how I missed it. The answer, when I finally got honest with it, was that I didn't miss it. I saw it. I just kept choosing to file it under he'll change, and it's not that bad because changing your whole life is terrifying and staying still, even in a bad situation, at least feels like something you chose. That's not wisdom. That's fear dressed up as patience. I know the difference now. What I did that night at the reception, walking the length of that room in my dress, in front of 200 people to get my parents, wasn't brave in the dramatic sense. It wasn't planned. I wasn't thinking about how it would look or what would happen next. I was just thinking about my dad at table 11 with his napkin in his lap, being gracious to strangers because that is simply who he is. And I knew I couldn't sit at that head table one more minute and let that stand. Doing the right thing rarely feels heroic in the moment. It mostly just feels necessary. Like you ran out of other options. Like the version of yourself you actually want to be finally got tired of waiting. The harder part came after. The conversations. The attorney. The apartment I moved into alone with no couch and curtains that needed hanging. Rebuilding a life that had been organized around a future that turned out to be built on someone else's terms is slow, unglamorous work. There were weeks I didn't feel strong. There were mornings I questioned every decision I'd made. That's not failure. That's what it actually looks like to start over. Not a clean break, but a long, uneven process of figuring out what you actually want, now that you're building it for yourself. My parents came to help me move into that apartment. My dad hung curtains. My mom organized my kitchen. We sat on the floor and ate pizza because I didn't have furniture yet, and nobody said anything about what the year had cost us. We just sat together, and that was enough. I think about Holden sometimes. I don't think about him the way I used to, with grief or anger or the particular ache of something wasted. I think about him the way you think about a lesson that took too long to learn. He showed me, clearly and consistently, who he was. The deficit wasn't in my seeing. It was in my willingness to act on what I saw. My dad is worth a walk across a full room. He always was. I just needed to be the kind of person who would take it.